In the high rooms of power, a crown feels cold and sharp. Kings sit where ambition and fear meet, and sometimes the throne becomes the instrument of a terrifying end. Listen close. These are the deaths that turned kings into warnings. 1. Elagabalus, d. 222 AD. He arrived as a priest king, a boy elevated beyond reason, and he fell in the cruel theater of Roman fury. The court that once worshipped his divinity ripped him down. Not a clean execution, but humiliation staged like a ritual, murder, mutilation, and then the final insult, his body dumped into the city drains. Imagine the young man whose face graced coins and altars, sliding face first into filth. That drop from divinity to refuse was both punishment and message. His death wasn't just killing, it was theatrical erasure. Religion, politics, and vengeance braided into a public spectacle meant to obliterate memory and shame a dynasty in one brutal act. 2. Commodus, d. 192 AD. He dressed as a gladiator and ruled with performative cruelty. Still, it was the intimacy of palace treachery that ended him. Poison failed. The plotters moved to close quarters, a strangling in his private bath that turned spectacle into private suffocation. Picture the public image of a lion-hearted emperor replaced by a man struggling for breath in a room meant for comfort. His fall exposed how ritualized violence can mutate into personal betrayal. The instruments of his staged power, actors, favorites, guards, became the hands that finished him. The final irony bites. A ruler who played at invincibility, undone by the small hidden mechanics of assassination. 3. Ramesses III, DC 1155 BC, a warrior king famed for repelling foreign threats. He met a death worse than any battlefield wound. A palace conspiracy that pierced throat and state. The so-called harem conspiracy was intimate violence. Daggers slipped between cushions, loyalties exchanged for survival, and then a wound that centuries later modern science would confirm. The image is corrosive. A pharaoh who defended Egypt from storming peoples, stripped of armor by whispered plans and secret knives. That a king's final ruin came from the very house meant to protect him. Chamber, temple, and inner court makes his death a slow unmaking of kingship itself. Number 4. Alexander the Great, d. 323 BC. He conquered the known world and still could not conquer that fragile next morning. In Babylon, the great commander sank into fever after feasting and celebration. Historians debate malaria, typhoid, even poisoning. But whatever the cause, the outcome was the same. A colossal career ending not with a heroic stroke, but with a small, wet collapse of the body. The horror here is the loss of narrative, an unstoppable force stripped of the dignity of battle, leaving only questions and a panicked scramble over succession. To die of something unseen, an enemy inside the blood, makes a conqueror's end oddly intimate and deeply unsettled. 5. Pyrrhus of Epirus, d. 272 BC. A general who made Pyrrhic victory a phrase. He survived battles only to be felled by an absurd, terrifying detail, a tile thrown from a rooftop in the chaos of street fighting. Imagine war elephants, disciplined phalanxes, and the slender, contemptuous arc of a domestic object rewriting a hero's fate. His death compresses tragedy and farce into one image. Glory undone by a civilian's hand, the universe's sudden reduction of epic to petty. It's a violent reminder that mythology meets mundane chance. And in that collision, even the great can die ludicrously. If this scratches that itch for the ugly truth behind crowns, subscribe now. You'll get the next deep dive into rulers who lost everything. 6. Attila the Hun, d. 453 AD. The scourge of Rome and ruler of dread, Attila's life of terror ended on his wedding night by a sudden, fatal nosebleed. After a night of celebration, his blood filled his throat. He choked, and the axe of history fell in the quiet of a tent. The contrast is brutal. Whole cities leveled by his orders, yet his final undoing was bodily and small. The image of a fearsome leader silenced by his own blood undercuts the myth and reveals a core truth. Bodies betray legends, and mortality is the great equalizer even for those who once commanded terror. 7. Caracalla, d. 217 AD. Brutal, capricious, and feared, Caracalla met his match in a single soldier's blade while relieving himself by the roadside. The moment compresses empire into humiliating vulnerability. An emperor's public face is ended by a private necessity, leaving a trail of blood on an ordinary path. The assassination is a jolt, the mighty cut down during a human pause, proving that authority can be inverted in an instant. The horror is immediate and humiliating. Emperor to corpse in the time it takes to finish a small, private act. 8. Philip II of Macedon, d. 336 BC. Struck down in a public ceremony, Philip's assassination was a brutal punctuation to a career of conquest and statecraft. Stabbed by a bodyguard in the bright light of spectacle, his death collapsed theater into slaughter. The killing's publicness amplified terror, not a secret overthrow, but a demonstration that even a stadium of witnesses can't save a leader from a well-placed blade. The political aftershock birthed empires and heirs who would remake the world. But in the moment, the father of Alexander lay mortally betrayed amid applause and gasps. 9. Pertinax, d. 193 AD. He tried to corral chaos and pay debts of state, but 87 days of reform made him enemies. The Praetorian Guard turned executioner. The scene is swift and ugly. Protectors become slayers, the instruments of order flipping into brutality. Pertinax's short, earnest reign ended in a chaotic puke of violence that said everything about how fragile attempts at normalizing power can be when the armed gatekeepers prefer plunder to law. It's the terror of being killed by the machinery you hope to reform. 10. Domitian, d. 96 AD. Stabbed in a palace conspiracy, Domitian's end was both personal vengeance and administrative correction. His death signaled a collective decision. When a ruler's rule becomes unbearable, institutions can repudiate him with a blade. The horror here is bureaucratic. The state not merely kills, but erases. Damnatio memoriae followed, a legalized obliteration that turned a man into an absence, removed from inscriptions, monuments, the cultural ledger. The murder wasn't theatrical. It was systematic, a quiet re-engineering of history through blood and erasure. 11. Mithridates VI of Pontus, 63 BC. He built resistance to Rome by mastering poisons, supposedly immunizing himself against death's quietest instrument. And when defeat came, his tactics failed him. An attempted suicide by toxin didn't work. He then ordered a loyal man to finish the deed. The layered irony is cutting. A master of chemicals who engineered resistance ended by a planned, intimate death. It's calculated, personal, and emblematic of a ruler who treated mortality like another field of conquest, until mortality refused to be conquered. 12. Qin Shi Huang, d. 210 BC. The first emperor of a unified China obsessed over elixirs and immortality, swallowing tonics that promised endless life. Those very potions likely poisoned him during one of his endless tours. This is a death born of fear turned combustible. A ruler terrified of death destroyed by the remedies meant to prevent it. The spectacle of his mausoleum, the terracotta army, speaks to monumental vanity. The reality is fragile, domestic, and terribly human. A pulse stopped because a man could not bear to accept an ending. 13. Darius III, d. 330 BC. After catastrophic defeat by Alexander, Darius fled, was passed over by allies, and finally killed by his own satraps. The end of empire is often bureaucratic betrayal. Kings turned fugitives, murdered by those who hoped to curry favor with victors. Darius's death mapped the collapse of Persia into personal backstabbing. The bitter image of a monarch abandoned on the road, his crown rendered meaningless by the very men sworn to support him. The horror is in the downgrade, thrown to fugitive to corpse. 14. Cambyses VI, d. 5522 BC. His end is wrapped in rumor, a self-inflicted wound in madness, an accident, or possible assassination, the sources argue. But the through line is chaos, a once powerful king undone amid confusion and reports of frenzy. To die amid rumor is to have your story stolen. Successors fight over meaning and power, while history scavenges truth. The cruelty of Cambyses' death is in the uncertainty, the narrative vacuum that invites violence and erases dignity. 15. Sennacherib, d. 681 BC. Reportedly murdered by his sons in a temple, his death destroys both family and sacred space. Patricide inside holy walls intensifies horror. The place of worship becomes a scene of blood and betrayal. For a king who sacked cities and carved his name into stone, to be felled by offspring inside a shrine perverts every sanctified bond. The familial rupture makes the wound deeper than conquest. It becomes a moral and religious rupture too. 16. Seleucus I Nicator, d. 281 BC. A founder of dynasties who carved territory from Alexander's ruin, Seleucus was later assassinated amid the endless music of successor rivalries. His death wasn't cinematic, it was cunning, a rival's blade, a political calculus. The pattern repeats. Building an empire earns you enemies whose knives speak in the whisper of hospitality and treaty. The coldness of a plotted murder after years of conquest makes such endings feel like bureaucratic subtraction. Subtract the man, leave the map. 17. Julius Caesar, d. 44 BC. Stabbed by conspirators inside the Senate, Caesar's murder was political theater disguised as virtue. The blades were offered by men calling themselves liberators, and the image of a leader bleeding in the civic center became a hinge in history. The horror is symbolic, a republic's rule punctured by assassination in a place meant for deliberation. Caesar's death demonstrates how public violence can be dressed as rescue, and how a nation's political theater can be weaponized into mortal betrayal. 18. Nero, d. 68 AD. Once Rome's theatrical emperor, Nero ended his life in flight and fear when the Senate declared him an enemy. His last moments were small and terrified, not the spectacle he staged for the populace. The descent from public pageant to private panic underlines the cruelty of downfall. The stage's lights gone out, the actor left in a corner to die. The scene is pathetic and tragic, the grandiosity of rule giving way to the human terror of escape. 19. Perdiccas d. 321 BC. As regent after Alexander's death, his failure in Egypt and perceived arrogances turned commanders into killers. Mutiny in a tent, blades from those who once followed. His swift murder marks the Diadoches' brutal churn. Loyalty shifting overnight, commanders turning executioners. The intimacy of his death, murdered in council during campaign, shows how fragile command was when unity evaporated into rivalry. 20. Vercingetorix, d. 46 BC. The Gaul who rallied resistance to Rome was paraded captive and later executed in Caesar's triumph. Stripped of power, displayed, and then killed in a spectacle meant to reinforce imperial dominance. The humiliation before death displayed led through Rome transformed a warrior into a lesson. Execution after public mockery collapses dignity into didactic terror. Death staged to teach submission, a life ended in the glare of triumphal timbers. Power breeds spectacle. Spectacle breeds enemies, and often those enemies become the final directors of a king's last act.